It's never been easy to know what to make of Rousseau. Among his contemporaries, conservative religious authorities could appreciate his attack on the theater while being horrified at his analysis of the political problems caused by Christianity. Intellectuals could value his contributions to the Encyclopédie while being scandalized by his criticisms of intellectual life. It was easy to regard him as a renegade or to dismiss him as a dealer in paradoxes. Nevertheless, one thing none of his contemporaries had any question about was his devotion to republicanism. His identification of himself as citizen of Geneva on the title page of almost all of his works made his republicanism clear, especially to subjects of monarchies. Upon awarding him the prize for the Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, the Academy of Dijon in France felt compelled to excuse itself by saying, in honoring Monsieur Rousseau's work, the Academy does not pretend to have adopted his political maxims, which do not accord with our customs. Even when the Genevan government later censored the social contract, it acknowledged that Rousseau was an extreme Republican rather than an anti-Republican. For some time, however, this one seemingly incontestable point about Rousseau has been contested. Certainly one reason for this comes from events after Rousseau's death in which the very meaning of republicanism has been at issue. From World War I until well into the Cold War, much of the debate about Rousseau in the English-speaking world was over whether he should be considered a collectivist, a totalitarian, or an enemy to liberty or not. Although the charges against him concerned the question of whether Rousseau can be regarded as liberal rather than whether he can be regarded as a Republican, none of them encourages the idea that he was the latter. This issue has largely been dropped within Rousseau's scholarship. You will find few people who are Rousseau specialists who call him a totalitarian, although it remains alive among non-specialists. More recently, scholars have turned more directly to the question of the precise nature of Rousseau's republicanism and whether he belongs to the tradition sometimes called neo-Roman republicanism. There's no question that Rousseau considered himself to be a supporter of the Roman version of republicanism. He never wavered from his claim in the dedicatory letter to the Second Discourse that the Romans were the model of all free peoples. Nevertheless, in the English-speaking world at least, those who treat this strand of republicanism, either from a historical perspective or a more theoretical one, are either silent or ambivalent about Rousseau. The most recent serious treatment of Rousseau from this perspective has been given by Philip Pettit last year in an essay. Philip argues that on the one hand, Rousseau's insistence that freedom requires not being subjected to the will of another agent or agency aligns him with this tradition. On the other hand, his rejection of the institutions associated with the mixed constitution represents a break from it. Philip Pettit is surely right that Rousseau insists on the importance of a single assembly of all the citizens, and that this assembly and it alone is the sovereign authority. Philip also acknowledges that Rousseau does recommend a mixed government. Indeed, Rousseau's treatment of the government in the social contract contains many of the features of the Roman government, including a senate, censors, tribunes, assemblies, and so on. The issue then is the difference between a mixed government and what Philip calls a mixed constitution. What Rousseau does not endorse is the idea that any of these institutions other than the assembly of all the citizens should be considered as sharing sovereign power. Indeed, it is clear that ultimately it is Rousseau's notion of sovereignty to which Philip objects, if I've understood him properly. This objection is rooted in the fact that the sovereign assembly is unconstrained by any law and that its decisions are not contestable by individual citizens. The problem that he identifies may be a real one, but it should be defined clearly. The issue is whether individuals remain subject to the decisions of the popular assembly even when those individuals believe that the assembly has been corrupted by factionalism, and therefore does not really represent the general will. Philip concludes, Rousseau does not ever confront the question raised. And he goes on to speculate about what answer would be led to by Rousseau's principles, finding that Rousseau can offer no satisfactory options. I would like to take a different direction and ask why Rousseau would not confront Philip's question. I would like to identify the different problem to which Rousseau gives greater urgency in his analysis of that problem. My account relates to Philip's in that it too focuses on Rousseau's separation of government from sovereignty. It aims less to question his description of Rousseau than to contest the conclusions he draws from it in his essay. He insists that Rousseau's citizens are restricted to the role of lawmakers in an assembly, and that they are unable to challenge the decisions of authorities. These are quotes. I will argue that Rousseau insists that citizens have not only the right, but the duty to hold the government accountable for its misapplications of the laws, and that no thinker, Republican or otherwise, insists on the importance of challenging governmental authority more than Rousseau does. The reason for this is that few regard the government as a more problematic authority than Rousseau does. My main intention in my remarks, then, is not really to contest Philip Petit's claim that Rousseau departs from a certain Republican tradition. Rather, it is to identify something worth pondering in his thought, and that it's relevant for understanding contemporary politics. I approach him in a certain way that my colleagues would find strange, I think, as an empirical political scientist. I'll begin by identifying what could be regarded as Rousseau's fundamental maxim about politics, what I will call Rousseau's rule. Contemporary political scientists are often guilty of reducing the complex thought of a great thinker to a single maxim. Although I should be hesitant to add to this list of unsophisticated application of a complex thinker's insight, I will overcome this hesitation for the purposes of this lecture. Rousseau gives his rule a simple and straightforward formulation in chapter 11 of book 3 of On the Social Contract. After saying, if Sparta and Rome perished, what state can hope to endure forever? If we want to form a lasting establishment, let us therefore not hope to make it eternal. He concludes, the body politic, like the human body, begins to die at the moment of its birth, and carries within itself the causes of its destruction. This statement hardly seems novel at all at first glance. In fact, it seems to be entirely commonplace, surprising only as an example of sober conservatism in a thinker not usually noted for such qualities. Few intelligent people, one might think, could possibly disagree with it. Nevertheless, there are serious thinkers whose work was known to Rousseau who did disagree with it. The most notable of these is Thomas Hobbes. Arguing against those who claim that experience proves that there are no grounds on which a stable politics can be established, Hobbes asserts, so, long time after men have begun to constitute commonwealths, imperfect and apt to relapse into disorder, there may be principles of reason be found out by industrious meditation to make their constitution, excepting by external violence, everlasting. Needless to say, he claims that these principles are precisely the ones he has set forth in his book. Hobbes is the one who engaged in industrious meditation. With this assertion, Hobbes gives force to the aspiration to solve the problems of politics once and for all, in a practical as well as theoretical way. An aspiration that shows itself repeatedly in political thought after Hobbes involving designs of political institutions, reliance on public administration, or efforts to settle partisan issues through appeals to judges. If politics is seen as intrinsically fraught with problems, this aspiration could be said to be seeking to abolish politics and its problems once and for all to make us better off. Hobbes's position allows us to see what Rousseau is claiming. He is not saying that the inherent limitations in the intelligence of humans means that we should not expect perfection from their contrivances. In other words, he is not making the mistake that Hobbes attributes to ignorant people who measure what is possible by what has happened so far. Rather, Rousseau is claiming that the limitations of what is possible for states exist in principle and cannot be overcome by any progress of human knowledge, by political science. In short, it is not the present imperfection of political science that accounts for the mortality of states. In fact, Rousseau claims that his own genuinely adequate political science demonstrates the necessity of this mortality of states. In asserting this, Rousseau is indicating that the aspiration to put an end to political problems once and for all is futile or even dangerous. To understand Rousseau's point, it is necessary to understand why, according to his political science, any conceivable body politic carries within itself from its birth the causes of its own destruction. There are two crucial Rousseauan ideas that lead to this conclusion. The first is the separation between the sovereign and government, and the second is his understanding of the general will. Richard Tuck has recently discussed the history of the separation between sovereign and government, showing that this distinction existed in some form well before Rousseau. Nevertheless, it is clear both that Rousseau insisted on the importance of this distinction and that he thought most of his readers, if not all of his readers, were likely to misunderstand it. He begins the chapter in which he makes the distinction on government in general in the social contract with a warning. I warn the reader that this chapter should be read carefully, and that I do not know the art of being clear for those who are not willing to be attentive. In his judgment on the polysynchrony proposed by the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, he asserts that the idea of aristocratic sovereignty is the worst of all conceptions of sovereignty. Expecting that readers might remember his claim in the social contract that elective aristocracy is the best form of government, he declares, I would wager that 1,000 people will again find here a contradiction with the social contract. That proves that there are even more readers who should learn to read than authors who should learn to be consistent. In the letters written from the mountain, he claims that the democratic constitution has hitherto been poorly understood by those who have discussed it. In particular, he says none of them have sufficiently distinguished sovereign from government, the legislative power from the executive. Finally, On the Government of Poland, in a chapter originally entitled Sovereignty, Where Does It Reside?, he begins, I hardly ever hear anyone speaking about government without finding they go back to principles that appear to me to be either false or doubtful. Elsewhere, in relation to misunderstandings of his work, Rousseau said he finds it a shame that writers are expected to be like painters standing outside an art gallery, examining the eyes of the patrons about to enter and providing them glasses so they can see the works of art properly. This is the fate of an author like Rousseau. So the evidence shows clearly that no matter how many thinkers before Rousseau might have made some version of his distinction, he clearly regards it as not yet adequately established. A simple and perhaps overly simple way to understand Rousseau's doctrine is to distinguish it from those of Hobbes and Locke. Like Hobbes, he insists that sovereignty should be understood as a way out of the state of nature, a condition in which men live without any political authority over them. The problem with Hobbes's compact establishing sovereignty, according to Rousseau's argument, is that those who make the compact remain in the state of nature with regard to the sovereign, who is outside of the compact. Whether the sovereign is an individual or group of individuals, those within the contract are to a very large degree subjugated to the person or body outside of it. Rousseau's solution to this is first of all to allow only a sovereign in which everyone participates. The sovereign remains outside of the compact in that there are only formal restrictions on what it can do. But all of the members who comprise it are inside of the compact. To use Philip Pettit's language about the Republican tradition, no one is subject to any individual or any body of which he is not an equal member. Second, Rousseau, like Locke, sees a separation of powers in which the legislative power is supreme as a necessary part of avoiding tyranny. In Rousseau's more radical version of the separation of powers, however, only the legislative power is the sovereign. The executive power, what he also calls on different occasions the government or the administration, is entirely subordinate. It has no share whatsoever in the power of the sovereign. Finally, the legislative power issues only laws of general application which are enforced by the government. The distinction between sovereign and government requires that each of these separate powers be restricted to its own realm. This separation between sovereign and government, properly understood, leads to the second of Rousseau's doctrines to which I referred. The sovereign's legislative powers, laws, are expressions of the general will. That is, they are general in origin as well as in application. The term general will refers both to the generality of the laws that issue from it and the disposition of those who vote on them, to consider the community rather than their particular good. This second point means, and this is what I want to stress here, that the doctrine of the general will is in part an empirical account of how any functioning group operates, as well as part of a normative doctrine of sovereignty. Rousseau insists that the general will remains constantly present even in a community in which individuals are almost entirely selfish. Such people wish to make the laws in a way that serves their own interest, or at least to evade laws that do not, but they do not want others to behave on this same principle. For a community to continue to exist as a community, at least this minimal sense of a common interest is necessary. An assemblage of people who had no desire whatsoever for laws that apply generally could not function as a society at all. It could be held together only by force. Moreover, it is not clear whether any amount of force would suffice for this. That Rousseau's account of the general will is an account of how groups actually function is connected to his view of the problems posed by factions. As a member of a faction, one wills the good of that faction at the expense of the larger community. In fact, this is part of what it means to be a good member of the faction. Whether that faction is a labor union, a political party, a public interest lobbying group, or a band of conspirators against the regime. Even someone who is not at all selfish will have stronger loyalties to some groups than to others. And the smaller the group is and the closer it is to its members, the stronger that loyalty is likely to be in ordinary circumstances. The general will of the faction, which from the perspective of the community as a whole is merely a corporate will be stronger than the general will of a larger community. A good community, then, will labor to eliminate factions and to increase loyalty to the larger group, largely through an education that promotes patriotism and a civil religion. There is, however, one faction that cannot be eliminated by legal measures, by patriotism, or by a civil religion, even or especially in a good community. That faction is the government. In effect, the government is itself a small community within the community that has its own general will. Without such a general will, it could hardly function as a unity. It could not be an effective government. It is quite natural for the members of the administration to think of it as representing the will of the community in a special way. Eventually, this belief will lead them to see themselves as citizens of the administration every bit as much as they are citizens of the country. As Rousseau says, the interests of partial social groups are neither less distinct from those of the state nor less pernicious to the republic than those of private individuals. And they even have an added disadvantage, that people glory in sustaining at any cost whatsoever the rights and pretensions of a body of which they are members, and that what would be dishonorable in preferring oneself to others disappears when one favors a large social group of which one is a part. By dint of being a good senator, one finally becomes a bad citizen. Note that the description of bad citizens here could easily be turned into a description of good citizens who would also glory in sustaining the rights of their community. Rousseau's point is not that politicians are self-seeking and corrupt by nature, although, of course, he was aware of that as a possibility. Indeed, the tendency that he identifies will be stronger precisely to the extent that members of the government are not self-seeking. Rousseau says tyranny of the leaders is a vice of station, by which he means that in a different station, this tyranny would not be a vice at all. The virtue of a good member of an administration is, when viewed from the perspective of the community, nothing but a vice of station. In the long run, the members of the government will tend to lose sight of the general will of the community as opposed to that of the government to which they belong. This may not be true of all of its members, but it will be a continuing temptation that will operate on all of them. The government will have endless opportunities to give in to this tendency, and it will be impossible for the rest of the community to resist absolutely every attempt. Eventually, with the best will in the world, the government must succeed in usurping the functions of sovereignty for its own benefit. This might take a very long time, but time is always on the side of the government. As Rousseau says, in an executed undertaking, they gain force. In a failed undertaking, they lose only time. In the best situation, the community resists the force, but eventually it loses ground bit by bit. Rousseau even suggests citizens should be so attentive to this that if at one point members of an administrative body say we want to stop entering the chamber by stepping with our right first foot and do it with the convenient foot, they should absolutely resist this as the first step toward tyranny. This, then, is why every community has the seeds of its own destruction within itself from the beginning. It has a government that will tend to usurp over the long term. Rousseau's point can be illustrated this way. Imagine a democratic community in which all citizens are genuinely concerned with the common good. A newly elected government forms an administration from among these public-spirited citizens. One can hardly ask for more. In order to perform its function of executing the law, this new administration must cultivate an esprit de corps that engages its members. Success in implementing its program can increase the general spirit of this body, but so can resistance on the part of those outside of the administration, particularly political opponents who may be equally public-spirited but have their disagreements with the policies of the administration. Devoted public servants are devoted to the administration of which they are a part and feel that they have more in common with each other than with those whom they wish to serve, particularly when those people fail to appreciate what the government is doing. As a new election looms, this general spirit finds a new focus. The administration must stay in office in order to pursue its agenda. To this, of course, can be added the selfish desire of members of the administration to keep their places. Even so, the least self-seeking of these members will develop the strongest factional spirit in favor of the administration. They will learn to look at legal formalities as inconveniences that hinder them in implementing the administration's program. They wish to find shortcuts around these cumbersome procedures. Even if the administration is removed from office, the new one, with its new policy preferences, will attempt to preserve the advantages acquired by the old one. All administrations will share the same vice or virtue of station in wanting the administration to be able to act effectively, however they might differ from each other on other points. These are the necessary consequences of Rousseau's understanding of what a state in fact is, not merely his normative description. The separation of sovereignty from government is necessary to prevent domination, but this separation creates a permanent community within the community that never ceases to exert its will. This is the cause of destruction that is present in every political community from its birth. When he analyzes the constitutional crisis of Geneva in the 1760s, Rousseau argues that it is the result of exactly this process of usurpation of sovereignty by the government. He says, 2 centuries ago, a political thinker could have foreseen what has happened to you. He would have said the institution that you are forming is good for the present and bad for the future. In fact, I think, a political thinker would be able to make this same prediction for every community. 2 centuries of political liberty would be a rather good result. Even the best cases, Sparta and Rome, as Rousseau says in The Social Contract, were doomed to the same fate over a longer period of time. Not even a perfect political science perfectly applied would be sure to save them. We can formulate Rousseau's rule as follows. The very need for a government creates conditions in which the government will eventually rule tyrannically. Or to put it more mildly, in which the political class will lose contact with the ordinary citizens. Among those who have failed to grasp the distinction between government and sovereign are those who in the middle of the last century accused Rousseau of being a totalitarian. They seem to believe that he attributes a sort of authority to the government that he in fact denies it. I once met such a person who referred to Rousseau as a statist, and I inadvertently enraged him by saying Rousseau is a statist who thinks the government is the source of all problems. This he did not want to hear. One might even say that these people fail to see what should be the strongest point of Rousseau's thought from their own perspective. Rousseau's distinctiveness as a political thinker stems in large part from the fact that he goes so far in asserting that governments are to blame for almost all political problems. Ignoring his claims that the tendency of all governments to usurp sovereign authority constitutes the fatal flaw of all states, these critics blamed Rousseau for encouraging governments to lay claim to this authority. If the eventual success of the government in usurping the authority of the sovereign is inevitable, how can it be slowed down? The basic device upon which Rousseau relies, famously, is regular meetings of the General Assembly of the Sovereign. This is the theme of a chapter entitled The Way to Prevent Usurpations by the Government. It could be a more direct title. In these periodic assemblies, the Sovereign Assembly considers 2 questions. 1, whether it wishes to preserve the present form of government, and 2, whether it wishes to preserve the present administration, the members of the government. The first is properly a question of sovereignty because it involves no judgment upon individuals. It's a general question. It concerns only the fundamental political laws in a general form. The second question, however, is a governmental question because it passes judgment on the individuals who make up the administration. It's not a sovereign judgment. Rousseau signals this difference by formulating the first question in terms of what the sovereign pleases, and the second in terms of what the people want. In effect, in this instance, the people are acting as a democratic government after they act as a sovereign. Rousseau is careful to say that even when these periodic assemblies form part of the fundamental political laws, they are suited to prevent or postpone usurpation. Postpone, I have been arguing, is the best they can do. There is no guarantee that the sovereign assembled will see the necessity to reform a usurping government, particularly when the usurpations take place only gradually and with plausible pretexts. Moreover, not every community has provisions for regular sovereign assemblies. What capacity does Rousseau's sovereign have to take notice of the stages of usurpation when the assembly does not take place? Indeed, one can ask what I think is the implicit question that Philip poses: what sort of existence does his sovereign enjoy when it is not legislating? Or what sort of existence do the citizens who compose the sovereign enjoy when they are not legislating? Rousseau shows his attention to this question by not concluding the social contract with his discussion of sovereign assemblies, which occurs at the end of Book 3. Aside from the discussion of the civil religion in Chapter 8 of Book 4, this book, Book 4, is the least studied of the 4 books that make up the social contract. Most commentators look at the practical details covered in Book 4 as standing outside of Rousseau's theoretical account of the first 3 books. This tendency, unfortunately, has sometimes led to misinterpretations of the earlier books. At the very least, this book deals with the practical consequences that accompany his principles. Book 4 continues the discussion of political laws begun in Book 3 by focusing at first on voting and elections. It concludes by presenting what Rousseau calls the ways to strengthen the constitution of the state. These include the civil religion, which strengthens devotion of the community and its laws, the dictatorship, an extra-legal institution which temporarily suspends the law during emergencies, the censorship, which expresses public judgment in matters that fall outside the law narrowly considered, and especially the tribunate, which is particularly important for the consideration of the relation between the government and the sovereign. Elsewhere, such as on the government of Poland, Rousseau points to the importance of precisely these Roman institutions. In fact, I think one can find references to them over and over in his work, both before and after the social contract. The importance of the tribunate, in particular, is indicated earlier in the social contract, precisely in the chapter of Book 3, where Rousseau discusses the tendency of the government to degenerate. He cites Machiavelli to indicate that prior to the establishment of this office, the form of government in Rome was always uncertain and up in the air. In the letters written from the mountain, Rousseau explains the significance of the tribunate, saying that prior to its establishment, Rome was not yet anything, and that later it had 500 years of glory and prosperity under it and became the capital of the world. In short, he seems to attribute to this institution an importance even beyond that of the others discussed in Book 4. In the letters written from the mountain, Rousseau indicates that his own purposes require modifications in the tribunate as it actually existed in Rome. He says, "I have shown upon what principles the tribunate should be instituted, the limits one ought to give it, and how all that can be done." Thus, in spite of his reference to Machiavelli, Rousseau's account of the tribunate has some novel features. In Machiavelli's account, the establishment of the tribunate was a means to stabilize without eliminating the conflict between patricians and plebeians. Prior to that establishment, Rome was dangerously unstable because the people were not represented in the government at all. It was a sort of mix of monarchy and aristocracy, with the former being represented in the consuls and the latter in the Senate. The tribunate established the power of the people without removing the power of the other 2 elements, thereby creating a permanent productive tension in Rome. This dynamic between the patricians and plebeians does play a part in Rousseau's account. His description of voting procedures approves of the way the Romans covertly gave precedence to the patricians without leaving the plebeians entirely powerless. The tribunes kept this precedence from turning into a simple dominance. Rousseau also cites Machiavelli in support of the idea that constant turbulence in the state is a good thing. Nevertheless, unlike Machiavelli, Rousseau surprisingly denies that a tribunate, when properly constituted, is a part of the government at all. Rousseau's innovation can be seen in his description of the problem his tribunate is meant to solve. The particular power that interests him is its ability to veto actions by the government. He says, although it can do nothing, it can prevent everything. He says it is important that it have very little force. Even a little too much, as was the case in Rome, would allow it to usurp power. The problem that a wisely tempered tribunate is meant to solve is this one. When an exact proportion cannot be established between the constituent parts of the state, or when indestructible causes constantly alter the relations between them, a special magistracy is then instituted which does not form a body with the others, which places each term back in its true relationship, and which creates a link or middle term either between the prince and the people, the government and the sovereign, or between the prince and the sovereign, or on both sides at once, if necessary. We have seen that in principle, indestructible causes always tend to alter the relations between the constituent parts of the state. Right? The indestructible cause of the general will of the government. The government's internal general will eventually lead it to usurp powers that belong to the sovereign, unless there is an extra-governmental body to maintain the relation with the sovereign. What sort of office is the tribunate? Rousseau says the tribunate is not a constituent part of the city and should not have any portion of the legislative or executive power. But it is for this very reason that its own power is greater. For although it can do nothing, it can prevent everything. It is more sacred and revered as a defender of the laws than the prince who executes them and the sovereign who makes them. At the end of the chapter, Rousseau repeats the essential point by saying that the tribunate is not part of the Constitution. The claim that the tribunate is more sacred and revered than the sovereign itself is puzzling. That it would be more sacred and revered than the government, not so puzzling. Its sacredness apparently stems from the fact that it preserves the laws, a task that seems to be beyond the sovereign that makes them. Although Rousseau is almost always critical of the idea of representation, and even insists that a private will cannot represent the general will, it appears that the tribunate does in some sense represent the sovereign when it acts against the government in order to reestablish its subordination to the sovereign. In fact, Rousseau makes this explicit in On the Government of Poland when he compares the liberum veto in the Polish Diet with the Roman tribunes, saying, the veto of the Polish deputies corresponds to that of the tribunes of the people at Rome. Now, they did not exercise this right as citizens, but as representatives of the Roman people. It appears that the sovereign acting only during periodic assemblies needs a representative to act outside of these assemblies. Eventually, I will qualify this statement, but first it should be developed. As his reference to the liberum veto shows, Rousseau is willing to consider multiple forms for such an extra-constitutional institution. He's not wedded to the Roman tribunes, even as he modifies them. Like the tribunate in Rome, the liberum veto in Poland becomes an instrument against the freedom it is meant to protect if it is not constructed properly. Rousseau says in itself the liberum veto is not a vicious right, but as soon as it passes its bounds, it becomes the most dangerous of abuses. It was the guarantee of public liberty. It is no longer anything but the instrument of oppression. It might be going too far to say that a well-tempered tribunate is a logical impossibility, but it is hardly surprising that Rousseau's discussion of this office in the Letters Written from the Mountain ends with the assertion that such an office not only doesn't exist in Geneva, but that it would not be appropriate in a modern community. As we've seen, the perfection of any body politic will be inherently unstable because of the government's tendency to encroach. An institution like the Roman tribunate might lead to a rather long period of relative perfection, and no doubt an improved version could do even better, but Rousseau never gives the slightest hint that even a perfectly designed extra-constitutional representative of the sovereign could avoid the corruption that awaits all governments. Ultimately, the tribunes themselves are sure to participate in this corruption. We illustrate this with a contemporary example. Roger Masters has suggested that the tribunate, as Rousseau sees it, bears some resemblance to the exercise of judicial review by the American Supreme Court. There are indeed striking similarities between Rousseau's discussion of the tribunate and Alexander Hamilton's discussion of the court in Federalist Paper number 78. Hamilton distinguishes the court from the executive and legislative branches by saying that it has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. This corresponds precisely to Rousseau's distinction between the government, which is nothing but force, and the sovereign, which expresses nothing but will. Although Rousseau goes farther than Hamilton by saying that the tribunate is not even a part of the Constitution. In addition, Hamilton says the courts were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and the legislature in order, among other things, to keep the latter within the limits assigned to their authority. In this case, the legislature is clearly understood to be something like Rousseau's government, in that its laws are subordinate to the more fundamental law of the Constitution, which more permanently expresses the people's will. In spite of these similarities, there are two very striking differences between Hamilton and Rousseau. Hamilton insists on the importance of maintaining judicial independence by service during good behavior, while Rousseau goes so far as to indicate both that tribunes should have short terms and that the tribunate itself should be suspended for periods of time. This difference is consistent with the second one. Hamilton famously calls the judicial branch the least dangerous branch, precisely because of its lack of force and will. Rousseau regards the temptation to exercise force and will as so great that in any form it might take, the tribunate, the liberum veto, the Supreme Court, is an extremely dangerous branch to Republican liberty, as necessary as it is. What institutions like the tribunate have in common is their mission of restoring balance between the government and the sovereign. The desirability of such an institution points to the need for the sovereign or its representative to oversee the executive branch. This might give the impression, this language of representative, that the sovereign itself has no capacity to oversee the executive other than when the sovereign assembly is in session. This, however, is not true. In On the Government of Poland, Rousseau says, for the administration to be strong, good, and proceed directly toward its goal, all the executive power must be in the same hands. But it is not enough for these hands to change. They must act, if possible, only under the legislator's eyes, and the legislator must be the one who guides them. That is the true secret for keeping them from usurping its authority. Certainly, the guidance given by the legislator can only be the laws themselves. For the legislator to meddle more directly in the functioning of the administration would violate the separation of powers as Rousseau understands it. The question, then, is what is meant by the administration working only under the legislator's eyes? Where are the legislator's eyes? Rousseau gives a particularly clear statement of the legislative power's functions in the letters written from the mountain, saying, the legislative power consists in two inseparable things, to make the laws and to maintain them. That is to say, to have inspection over the executive power. This inspection takes place at each new sovereign assembly when the sovereign is asked whether it wishes to maintain the same form of government. Any answer to this question must depend on a judgment about whether the existing government has been performing its function well. But the question is, does this judgment take place only when the sovereign is assembled? Or does it in some way precede the sovereign assembly? It might appear that the only time that the sovereign really exists in a way that allows it to act is during the assembly itself. And one could plausibly, but in my view incorrectly, read the social contract as suggesting this. In the letters written from the mountain, however, Rousseau makes it clear that while the sovereign can act only in the General Assembly, it exists all of the time. When analyzing Geneva, he says, in a state such as yours, where the sovereignty is in the hands of the people, the legislator always exists, although it does not always show itself. It is assembled and speaks authentically only in the General Council, but outside of the General Council, it is not annihilated. Its members are scattered, but they are not dead. They cannot speak by means of laws, but they can always keep watch over the administration of the laws. This is a right, this is even a duty attached to their persons, and which cannot be taken away from them at any time. Thus, while the sovereign can speak only in the General Council, it can keep watch over the government through the ordinary citizens. Indeed, keeping watch over the government is an essential duty of citizens. We'll have to see what sort of action this keeping watch can lead to if the sovereign can speak only in the General Council. But first, it will be useful to give some idea of how it takes place. This can be seen from Rousseau's discussion of the circles or men's clubs of Geneva in the letter to D'Alembert, written before the social contract. He introduces the subject of the circles by raising the question of which social practices will be displaced by the establishment of a theater. The letter to D'Alembert is about whether Geneva should fund a public theater. Rousseau says if the theater is better or less bad than what it will replace, it should be encouraged. If the reverse is true, it should be discouraged. Primary among the practices that Rousseau claims will be undermined by the theater is the circles, or societies of 12 to 15 persons who meet together most afternoons to gamble, chat, read, drink, and smoke. Noting that many regard these clubs as the source of vices, right? Who would defend smoking, for example? Rousseau himself stresses their political function, saying our civil discords, during which the necessity of affairs oblige us to meet more often and to deliberate coldly and calmly, cause these tumultuous societies to be changed into decent associations. Later, he describes the conversations that take place in the circles as grave and serious discourse, involving fatherland and virtue. Rousseau concedes that the gambling and drunkenness facilitated by the circles are bad, but he insists that these are unavoidable accompaniments of the good that comes from them. He argues that the fiercest opponents of the circles are not those who fear the moral corruption that goes along with them. Rather, they are those who fear their political consequences. He says, it is only the fiercest despotism which is alarmed at the sight of 7 or 8 men assembled, ever fearing that their conversation turns on their miseries. The circles, then, are an institution that stands outside of the political constitution narrowly considered, in which citizens can discuss the government freely. They can watch over the government and say what they see. The theater is an institution that is welcomed by a government that wishes to divert citizens from their duty of supervision. The point here could not be missed in the Genevan context. Rousseau is intimating that the elite who support the establishment of the theater are hoping to distract the majority of the citizens from political affairs, and that the conservatives who object to the circles on moral grounds are the dupes of this effort. There is one passage from the social contract that is sometimes interpreted a way that is incompatible with this account of citizens who meet in private to discuss the government. In Book 2, Chapter 3, Rousseau discusses the conditions necessary for a genuine expression of the general will. He argues that factionalism makes it impossible for the general will to express itself, and says if when an adequately informed people deliberates, the citizens would have no communication among themselves. The general will would always result from the larger number of small differences, and deliberation would be always good. He concludes, in order for the general will to be well expressed, it is therefore important that there be no partial society in the state and that each citizen give only his own opinion. Some scholars read this as requiring that the citizens must be kept from deliberating among themselves in small groups at any time, not just as they enter the polling place. The club seems to violate this condition. Given that Rousseau was writing the social contract at the very time he wrote the letter to D'Alembert, it would be hard to argue that he changed his mind on this issue over time. We don't even know which one he wrote first, really, the passages. Does he contradict himself or not? The question is what Rousseau means in the social contract by saying citizens having no communication among themselves if they are adequately informed. At what stage of public deliberation is this isolation necessary? Rousseau's most detailed account of public deliberation is in the letters written from the mountain. In this account focuses precisely on the question of sovereign oversight of the government. In fact, it occurs just after Rousseau's claim that one of the two constitutive elements of legislative power is inspection over the executive power. Here, Rousseau insists that this oversight is, once the fundamental laws have been established, the sole function of the sovereign. Geneva has entered a political crisis because the government denies this function and has made itself the sole interpreter of the laws. That is, they make themselves obeyed in the name of the laws while disobeying them themselves. Geneva lacks any extra-constitutional institution like the tribunate to protect the laws against this government usurpation. Lacking such an institution, it might appear that the only device left for the exercise of this function of sovereignty is the General Council. And in a sense, this is true, because it is only in the General Council that the government can call to account in an ultimate way. Nevertheless, as we have seen, Rousseau insists that even when the sovereign does not show itself in the council, it continues to exist. From the continued existence of the sovereign outside of the General Council and the sovereign's power of overseeing the government, Rousseau derives the right of individuals or groups in their capacity as citizens to make représentations or remonstrances to the government about its abuses. As he says, this right gives you inspection, no longer over legislation as previously, but over administration. He then poses and answers a series of questions. But in the end, what is this right? How far does it extend? How can it be exercised? In addition to being a traditional Genevan right established by law, according to Rousseau, this is a right that exists, in fact, in any government. It is important to specify that making a remonstrance is not an act of sovereignty. Rousseau says this is not to vote in General Council. It is to state an opinion about matters that ought to be brought there. Since one does not count the votes, this is not to give one's suffrage. It is only to state one's opinion. This opinion is in truth only that of a private individual or of several. But since these private individuals are members of the sovereign and can represent it sometimes by their multitude, reason wants one to pay respect to their opinion then, not as a decision, but as a proposition that demands a decision, and that sometimes makes one necessary. The citizens making the remonstrance are representatives of the sovereign in the same sense as the tribunes are, but their remonstrances do not have the same legal force as the actions of the tribune. Even if virtually every citizen were to join in the remonstrance, this would not make it an act of sovereignty. Rousseau says, even if it is unanimous, their opinion will never be anything but a remonstrance. To use the language of the social contract, the unanimous judgment would be merely the will of all rather than the general will. Rousseau states that making remonstrances is stating an opinion rather than casting a vote. A few pages earlier, he indicates that this distinction is an important one that is not maintained consistently enough in French. He puts the point this way: to deliberate, to give an opinion, to vote are three very different things that the French do not distinguish enough. To deliberate is to weigh the pro and the con. To give an opinion is to state one's advice and to give the reasons for it. To vote is one's suffrage, when nothing is left to do but to collect the votes. First, the matter is put into deliberation. On the first round, one gives one's opinion, one votes on the last round. Clearly, each of these does take place within a sovereign assembly, but only the last is an act of sovereignty. The other two can take place in principle at any time and any place. The expression of one's opinion to a group outside of the assembly is not only allowed, but is sometimes a duty. Remonstrances, then, are expressions of an opinion by a citizen or group of citizens that a law has been violated by the government. What can or must the government do when confronted by a remonstrance accusing it of injustice? One possibility, of course, is that it acknowledges the error of its ways and corrects what it has done. Not likely. The more likely possibility is to deny that it has done anything wrong at all. Cannot the government plausibly present itself as a more legitimate representative of the sovereign will than the remonstrators are? This Rousseau denies, although he does not claim that the government's assertions have no weight in the matter. The issue then is, when these two moral authorities clash, who is to be the judge between them? The Genevan government claims to have settled the matter, but Rousseau says, when a number of citizens affirm that there is injustice, and when the magistrate accused of that injustice affirms that there isn't, who can be judged if it is not the informed public, and where can this informed public be found at Geneva if it is not in the General Council? Rousseau insists that the Sovereign Assembly is the only possible judge in such a case. The best option is to bring the matter in question to the next regularly scheduled assembly, but if there is no regular schedule, the assembly must be called into session. Of course, it is likely that the government will refuse, even or especially in the face of public demonstrations, to call such an assembly. Clashes between the government and the citizens are no more of a problem for Rousseau's theory than for any account of Republican government. An interesting feature of his position is that it is the citizens and not the government who are understood as the conservative force. They are reacting not simply to government injustice, but to the government's violation of the fundamental political laws of the community. Rousseau is reticent in spelling out the consequences that follow from the government's refusal to consult the General Council. Following the same practice that he had followed in his letter to D'Alembert, he stopped short of offering specific advice to the Genevan situation. He says only that when one knows where one is and where one ought to go, one can direct oneself without effort. One could say, one knows when one needs to take to the streets. Later, On the Government of Poland, he shows no such reticence. He says that whenever the Diet or General Council is prevented from assembly, a confederation should rise up to restore the laws. He compares such a confederation with the Roman dictatorship, which preserves the Constitution by suspending ordinary laws in a temporary emergency. Just as the remonstrances of citizens can be compared with the Roman tribunes, an act of resistance by the citizens can be compared with the Roman dictatorship. These passages support the suggestion that Book 4 of the Social Contract is not a mere appendage to Rousseau's theory. Institutions and practices that aim at maintaining the Constitution are a part of the theory. Let us assume that the remonstrators do succeed in having a General Assembly called to act as judge between them and the government. When describing this need for a judge, Rousseau says, it would then be up to the general will to decide. For in your state, that will is the supreme judge and the unique sovereign. This statement seems to indicate that it is the assembly acting as sovereign that passes judgment between the government and the remonstrators. But this cannot be true because this judgment is not a law. It is a judgment about which individual's interpretation of the law is correct. It involves deciding between two particulars. Rousseau says this clearly a couple of pages later when talking about the reestablishment of general councils. These assemblies, which by a very important distinction will not have the authority of the sovereign but of the supreme magistrate, far from being able to innovate anything, will only be able to prevent all innovation. It's the government that's the innovator, not the people or the assembly. The judgment of the General Council is comparable to the second stage of the periodic assembly described in the social contract. In the first stage, the sovereign establishes the form of government, and in the second, the people decide who is to be in the government. In effect, as a party in the dispute, the government loses its status as government and yields it to the assembly. I believe I have demonstrated that in spite of, or in fact because of, his insistence on an absolute sovereign, Rousseau insists on the importance of an active citizenry who watch over the government, and if necessary, mobilize against it. This is so even if he does not address the problem of calling into question the justice of a law, Philip's problem. Of course, our problem in certain circumstances, right? He regards the unjust application of laws by a usurping government as the more urgent and likely problem. The problem isn't that we have bad laws, the problem is that we have a government that applies the laws unjustly. Characteristically, he suggests that remonstrances will follow persecution of an individual who has been condemned without the government following proper legal procedure. This is true from the political economy in 1753, in which he praises the Romans for never executing anyone without having proper legal procedures of a trial, all the way through the Rousseau Juge de Jean-Jacques, the dialogues, which are largely a meditation on proper legal procedure. He claims that this problem, the persecution of an individual who is condemned without proper legal procedure, is of the utmost political importance, saying everywhere that innocence is not in safety, nothing can be. Everywhere that the laws are violated with impunity, there is no longer any liberty. Who violates the laws with impunity? The government. In short, the violation of fundamental laws by the government is usually a more urgent problem than the existence of unjust laws. Now, I thank you for your patience with my technical explication of Rousseau. I'd now like to apply it in general terms. Rousseau's account of citizen oversight of the government leads to several conclusions of interest to us today, I think. First, Rousseau's rule that the tendency of the government to usurp is the fatal flaw of every civil society helps us to understand the phenomenon of a well-intentioned political class whose good intentions themselves alienated progressively from its fellow citizens. Second, his account of citizens who in a way represent the sovereign by remonstrating against the government help us to understand the sort of protest movement that insists on supporting the very laws that the government fails to execute impartially. Third, his analysis allows us to recognize a tendency that his thought promotes, a pervasive mistrust of government, a sort of popular republicanism that always looks for outsiders to rescue us from the government, but which is always disappointed when these outsiders become insiders. Finally, Rousseau's account of the inevitable decline of states teaches the important lesson that efforts to move beyond the strife that characterizes political life are bound to be futile. Politics will always be with us. Thank you.
again, from my point of view, many thanks to the organisers of this wonderful conference that I've enjoyed. I'd also like to say many thanks to Chris, because this is actually one of the most interesting papers on Rousseau I've ever read or listened to. I think it's absolutely terrific. It doesn't solve my problem, unfortunately. Well, actually, but maybe we can just lay it out, at least very briefly, how I see things. So, just by way of background, let me give a few propositions that I think are importantly shared by Rousseau with some of his predecessors, because I think we probably generally don't share them. So the first claim is that the sovereign is not the government. The one to introduce that claim is Baudin, Jean Baudin, as part of establishing his absolutist view of things against the Republican tradition. And of course, the next very prominent person to defend it was Hobbes in the 17th century, less than 100 years later. I think Rousseau clearly goes along with this. The sovereign is not the government. That you really have to get that absolutely clear in your mind to read Rousseau, as I think we both agree. The second thing that he also says, which is shared with Baudin and with Hobbes, is that the job of the sovereign is to make the law. The sovereign does the legislation, and legislation only. Okay. The next question is whether the sovereign that does the legislation should be a single person or a single body, or whether it could be the job of the sovereignty, the job of legislation, could be divided between coordinated bodies or individuals. That would be a mixed sovereign or a mixed constitution. And very strongly, Baudin, Hobbes, and Rousseau say absolutely no. And they have the same argument that occurs in all three, well, especially in Hobbes and Rousseau, and later actually in Kant. And the argument is that, first of all, that the legislator has to have power over the law, not himself, herself, itself, themselves, subject to the law. The argument there is that law involves command, that's what it is, legislating is giving commands, but you can't give commands to yourself, right? You can't say, do that, because you can't be held to it. He that binds can loose, as Hobbes says. And so the legislator, the sovereign, who makes the law, is above the law, absolutely above the law. And the other aspect of the sovereign power in all their views is that, of course, if somebody else had power over the sovereign, then that somebody else would be the sovereign, not the sovereign. So there has to be, it's like a proof of the existence of God. It's a proof of the existence of a single individual or body who has to be at the source of the law. And why does this body have to be a single body? Why does it not have to divide out its power? Why, for example, couldn't a group of citizens challenge it and say, that's not the correct law? They might stand up, but the best law would be such and such. Well, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Kant argue in slightly different terms, and you can't have that, because if there's a dispute of this kind with the sovereign, there has to be a body to decide the dispute. But then that body would be a body that's in control of the sovereign, and it would be the true sovereign. So the sovereign has to be unchallengeable, incontestable. That's really core in the view of all three. To that extent, all three of them are absolutists. Of course, Baudin and Hobbes thinks the sovereign could be a monarch or an aristocratic committee. And Rousseau thinks, they also think it could be a committee of the whole, what they call a democratic committee. But Rousseau's insistent the only possible sovereign, this absolute, unique, undivided role, has to be an assembly of all the citizens. And that's really where you begin to see the impact of the Republicanism, because he recognizes that if you're subject to an independent will of a king or an aristocratic committee, you're going to be dominated. And so the only possibility is that this sovereign should include everybody. Okay, now, one thing that's worth noticing is that if you believe in, for example, mixed government, you needn't believe in a mixed sovereignty according to this view, because the government isn't the sovereign. Now, those of us who think that there is no easy divide between the legislature and the other bodies of government, for example, the judiciary and the executive, those of us who think that the judiciary and the executive are all involved in the business of making law, because interpreting the law, and the law never interprets itself, interpreting the law is itself law-making. So those of us who believe that think that even separation of powers already involves mixing the sovereign, mixing the constitution. But you've got to think into Rousseau's view that we can congeal all lawmaking in one particular person or body called the sovereign, and nobody else makes law. The sovereign only makes law. Now, if you think that, of course, you can think, well, the government, those are the other lot, that do the administration and so on. Well, they can be mixed in various ways, divided up and so on. And of course, they have to be, as Chris emphasizes, subject to the ultimate authority of the sovereign. Okay, now with that as background, here's the problem that I raised for Rousseau. I call it Rousseau's dilemma, but a different dilemma from the one that Richard was talking about yesterday. Rousseau, in The Social Contract, basically argues that it's fine to enter society because it's going to be a way of giving you civil freedom, as he calls it. But of course, it will give you civil freedom only if the sovereign assembly established on entering society, that's the sovereign, embodies the general will, as he calls it. How do you know what the general will is? Well, if this assembly, this sovereign, votes by majority for a certain measure, and a number of conditions are fulfilled, then the majority vote, as he says, say, at the beginning of Book 4 of Social Contract, is going to reveal the general will. The conditions are that the sovereign really is just thinking about laws, general laws, not thinking about other matters. The conditions are that there's an advisor, he calls that person a legislator, who keeps the assembly informed, so they're not making mistakes based on ignorance or error. And the third is that people really think as citizens when they vote. They don't think as members of a faction, and they don't think in selfish terms when they vote. But he recognizes that the assembly itself, the sovereign itself, can actually be factionalized, and that the majority vote passed, and therefore the laws established, may not reflect the general will. That remains a possibility that he's quite clear about. And now, here's my dilemma. What does Rousseau say to people who genuinely believe, and perhaps correctly believe, that, hey, this assembly has actually been passing factionalized laws that do not reflect the general will in his sense? And it seems to me he's got a hard choice. One is, he says that, well, people who really believe that, they're now released from the social contract. They're no longer subject to the authority of the sovereign. But that's a very bad choice, because that means that now the state is extremely unstable. People can peel away rightfully, according to Rousseau's picture, if they, in good faith, believe that it's not the general will that's been made into law. The other hard choice, the other option, the other horn of the dilemma is, he says, okay, no, they can't opt out because the state will be destabilized. But then he has to say, and I quote, where there is no general will, there is no freedom. That's also on Book 4 of the book. So he's got to say, these people have just got to live in unfreedom now. So that's the hard dilemma that I was posing in that paper called Rousseau's Dilemma. Now, in my diagnosis of the problem, what I said was, the problem is that Rousseau has broken with the other, more Roman tradition of Republicanism, which involved not just the value of freedom as non-domination, Rousseau has that, but also involved the commitment to the mixed constitution. And that means, of course, they all thought the law was made in part by the legislature, but it was interpreted by the executive and by the courts and so on. And they thought that essentially it was good that the sovereign was divided into different groups like that. The lawmaker, I should say, because the word sovereign was only introduced by Baudin, was divided amongst these different groups because there was a check and a balance there. And so my diagnosis was that, look, if Rousseau had allowed, but he can't in his terms allow, that lawmaking is the citizens' business in their more private capacity as well as the business of the assembly, then he would allow contestation. And so you get some pushback against laws that are factional. And you get the possibility of a resolution, and the assembly, if it passes a factionalized law, is going to recognize it's likely to get pushback, there's likely to be problems, and you get at least a dynamic that can lead to a resolution of that problem. But in the Rousseau picture, once the sovereign has spoken, the assembly has spoken, citizens in their private capacity or in their group capacity, like this minority, that minority, they have to be silent too because they can't speak back. They have nothing against the law. Now, what Chris has shown, I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, I truly learned deeply from reading this paper. What he shows is that I'm quite wrong to suggest that the citizens have a purely passive role as individuals in Rousseau's Republic, because he identifies a contestatory role that citizens play in Rousseau's Republic, that I didn't allow for, which is a contestatory role of challenging the government, right? Not the sovereign, the government. And in particular, challenging the government on the grounds that it is not interpreting the laws properly or not living up to the laws. The problem, as Chris said, isn't that we have bad law, right? No problem with the sovereign, but the problem is what they address, the contestatory citizenry, is that this government is not living up to the law. And the tribunate is a way of institutionalizing that sort of challenge, and remonstrances of the kind that we heard about are the remonstrances of citizens against the government in how it interprets the sovereign. So I had two claims in a way. One was that there's a problem with the sovereign, if the sovereign is allowed to be so absolute, which is that if you believe it's factionalized, either he allows you to get out, destabilizing the state, or if you are forbidden that, you've got to admit you live under bad laws, under laws that make you unfree because they don't express the general will. My second claim was that citizens, the diagnosis, citizens don't have a contestatory role in relation to the lawmaking. What Chris has shown is that citizens really do have a contestatory role in the Rousseauian world. But of course, it's not the role of contesting the sovereign, it's the role of contesting government. And so the trouble is that my original dilemma, as I think you're not denying that, my original dilemma remains in place. How does Rousseau deal with the issue that if you believe that the assembly is factionalized, he's going to have to tell us, are you allowed to leave the state, or do you just have to say, lump it, as we say, and live under a state that you recognize makes you unfree, not free, because it's factionalized law. Thank you very much, Chris. That was really terrific.
Could I respond for a minute? I want to thank Philip doubly, obviously for these remarks, in which he very lucidly laid out the dilemma that he sees Rousseau as falling into, but also for the original article in which he laid out this argument, which was what led me to my chain of reasoning that I gave today. When I first read the article, my first thought was to try to think about whether there's a simple answer to the dilemmas that Philip points out. And the direction in which one would have to go is to think about the question of what Rousseau means by law and what counts as a law and so on. That would be a very long and I'm not sure very profitable hair-splitting road to follow. Because the issue that Philip raises is an issue of theoretical importance and also practical importance. This is what led me to the question of granting the dilemma that Philip, at least provisionally granting, right? Because we could take this other avenue to discuss what does Rousseau mean by a law, what would be recourse for denying that something actually is a law, which would be the way he would have to, the subject would have to address this. I thought, well, why is it that the answer to Philip's dilemma isn't clearly spelled out by Rousseau? Because it's an important dilemma. And that's what led me to start thinking more clearly than I had done before about what Rousseau considers the practical dilemma for citizens to be, right? And what led me to this treatment of this view of the government as the source of the problems, and the idea that it's the application of laws to citizens unjustly, whether they are just or unjust laws in the first place, that is what he regards as the really central, practical political question for citizens. That the problem is less the formulation of good laws than it is the administration of them or the application of laws to particular individuals, particularly in legal proceedings. One of the things that occurred to me in the course of this is to think about the way in which Rousseau uses his own case. This is his great talent, right? Rousseau, every petty incident in Rousseau's life turns in his hands to an exploration of a profound human problem. And of course, the legal proceedings against him throughout Europe after the publication of The Social Contract and even more Emile led him to think very much about this question. And it occurred to me that almost everything he wrote after the censorship of his work is about this question of the way in which governments subvert legal procedures in their persecution of individuals, and the way in which even the individuals who are not the victims of those legal procedures have a stake in the results. So, instead of attempting to solve Rousseau's dilemma, as Philip has laid it out for you today, and as he lays it out in more detail in his article, I want to thank him for posing the dilemma, precisely for leading me to think of another aspect of Rousseau's thought that I hadn't appreciated sufficiently before, and I think other Rousseau scholars also haven't appreciated. So I will, it's not a response to your dilemma, right? But it's an expression of gratitude for the chain of reasoning that I was led to by thinking about why there isn't an obvious response to that dilemma.
Okay, thank you very much for your great introduction. Thank you for your interesting comments. And now it's time for questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting lecture. My question is if you can be more explicit about Rousseau's concept of government, because it seems to me to be very difficult, in fact, concept in his conception, because he speaks much about general will and about assembly of citizens, and he gives some more precise description about his conception and those considerations about the government of Poland. What he said there is that in fact citizens that the deputies should have some instructions from local communities and then go to the Warsaw, to the general diet of Poles, and under that condition, if we have this assembly of citizens disputing about the general will, and then the government, which in fact is an administrative office in Rousseau, and they should only apply laws, and they are constantly very much senses to do so, then it's very difficult how this government can operate in Rousseau terms. So, yeah.
Good. Is this one? No.
Which one you want to use?
I'll use this.
Okay.
Your question would demand an extraordinarily long answer, but I think that the passage you referred to in the Government of Poland is very interesting in this way because it's at the center of Rousseau's reservations about representation, right? That he talks about sending the representatives to the national parliament with precise instructions about how they're to vote, and if they violate those instructions, they're put on trial for their lives, and if their departure was not justified, they're then executed immediately, right? So this is not Rousseau's moderation that we see in this. But the question of representation for him, I think, is very much this. Why is representation such a difficulty? It's this problem that I talked about as stemming from Rousseau's analysis. This idea that we have a suspicion of the government, and the suspicion of the government that we tend to have in representative democracies is that we suspect that these people who call themselves our representatives are not representing us. Look at them. Right? Look at the way they live their lives. Look at the parties they go to. Look at the things they do. They're not like us. They're not representing us. When they run for office, they emphasize their similarity to us. They are like us. And particularly, they're like us in being outsiders, not like the people who are in office now. And Rousseau's position suggests that this is the dilemma of representative democracy. We demand that the representatives represent us. The representatives claim to represent us, and we can see perfectly well that because they have certain power and we don't, that they don't represent us. Pierre Benoit has an essay about this in which he refers to a remark from Stendhal, who says that the predominant characteristic of modern democracies is impotent hatred. And I would say that looking at that from the standpoint of the middle of the 19th century when Stendhal said it, it seems ridiculous. Looking at American democracy through its history as being characterized by impotent hatred seems ridiculous. On the other hand, looking at American democracy in recent days as being characterized by a sense of impotent hatred of one side of the political spectrum that then satisfied itself in some sense, leading to a sense of impotent hatred by the other side of the political spectrum, seems, at least temporarily, a very plausible account, and an account that's based upon something like Rousseau's analysis of the way in which the political class of the governors become estranged from the people over the long run, with the best of wills. Right? They want to govern well, and that means they want to govern effectively. That means they have an esprit de corps. They identify with the government with a perfectly good conscience. So that's where I'm led by your question. Again, there are very many technical aspects of what Rousseau understands a law to be and so on that we could enter into. But I think that the particular value of Rousseau for a conference like this is the way he presents us arguments that lead us to reflections about the practical dilemmas we find ourselves in today.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the talk. That was very theory of resistance, which I think is not common knowledge, and Benjamin Constant, for example, argues one of the things that Rousseau gets wrong is precisely that he doesn't have a theory of resistance, and you seem to suggest that he does. My question is, if he does have a theory of resistance, one would expect him to have a fairly well-developed theory of political obligation, or a theory of the kind of judgments that might be involved when you're making a decision to resist the government. And it sounded to me that you were saying that there might be two different kind of pathways that citizens could choose. One would be the slightly softer way of remonstrating, and one would be rather, I think it's the Poland text, you make a rather harder choice to sort of forcefully resist the government. I was also thinking about Hume's essay on passive resistance, which you probably know, in which he says, these kinds of judgments are extremely difficult to call. You have to be extremely careful before you launch into an act of resistance. So does Rousseau have any argument or particularly well-developed theory along those kind of lines?
Not a theory, right? And I would put it this way. What he says in Letters Written from the Mountain, when he's discussing this Genevan political crisis that came about because of the burning of the social contract in Geneva and citizens saying that this has not been done following legal procedure. I mentioned the remark, he says, once you clearly know where you stand, it's easy to figure out what to do. And this is something that I think is also not sufficiently acknowledged in understanding Rousseau in two ways. One would be if we ask the question about the formal characteristics that anything must have to be a law, this suggested untaken avenue to answer Rousseau's dilemma that I didn't take. There's a tendency to think that there's only one set of laws that could be sufficiently general that would have to apply every place. Every place would have to have the same sort of laws. Right? But Rousseau certainly does not regard that as true at all. The best example I can think of to illustrate this is even changing laws within one community. He gives the example in the social contract of the Roman change in voting laws to a secret ballot. He says Cicero objected to it, saying this is a sign of the corruption of Rome. We should have a public ballot. Everyone should stand up and say what they're voting for, and so on. And Rousseau says, that's fine when there's no corruption in the community, but once people are buying and selling votes, you've got to find a way to prevent them from doing it. And a secret ballot means they don't know whether the seller has actually delivered the product. And so a general law would be secret ballot, not secret ballot. Is Rousseau in favor of the secret ballot, or is he in favor of the public ballot? And the answer is yes, right? I mean, it depends upon the particular circumstances. And if you understand the particular circumstances that you're in, the decision is actually easier than people make it out to be. Another example I would give of this is the question in the letter to D'Alembert in the theater. People generally say Rousseau is arguing against establishing a theater in Geneva. He says very explicitly in the text, I don't know what Geneva should do. Right? So, that's what could be clearer than that. He says that if Geneva is seduced by the arguments into thinking that the theater will be a wonderful political institution for them to have, then that shows that Geneva has become the sort of community in which the theater can do them no harm. If, on the other hand, Geneva understands the political costs that might be true, then Geneva is a different sort of community. I'm not there. So the people who are there, if they can understand clearly the situation that they are in, will know what is called upon them for action. The difficulty is for citizens to be able to clarify to each other what the situation is that they find themselves in. I'll give one more example to illustrate this sort of issue. I grew up in a small town in which people did not lock their doors when they left their house. And there would occasionally be a robbery, and people would say, well, should we start locking our doors? And someone would say, but if your next door neighbor bakes an extra pie and brings it over to your house and you're not home, how is she going to get it into your kitchen? So of course you shouldn't lock your doors. But on the other hand, there are other sorts of communities in which your next door neighbor isn't baking pies and people are robbing things, so you should lock your doors. And the question is, knowing when you are in one of those forms of community that's in danger of changing into the other one. And I don't know that, and I think Rousseau's insistence would be, a theory doesn't tell you that, right? The question is, citizens being able to explain what to themselves and each other, what sort of community it is in which they live. And if they can do that clearly, you don't need a theory of obligation and resistance. You then know whether you can resist. Of course, it's not so easy because there are plenty of people who want to trick you about this, right? So that's the problem.
Just following up on that, because so when Philip was talking about the original dilemma, he put it that the reason why Rousseau didn't want to divide the sovereignty was because of the kind of infinite regress problem. But presumably another reason, and here it fits with what you just said, answer the last question, there's a design choice here, that to also divide sovereignty is to precisely create the factional problem. So it's not that he's ignoring this problem, he's sort of saying rather you need an alternative design choice, which is to try and render the possibility of the corruption of the general will less likely according to the circumstances of your society. And that's a better way of thinking about this issue than dividing sovereignty, because apart from the infinite regress problem, it's actually going to create that corruption precisely because what it allows people to do is to represent themselves as factions through partial representation in one of the split sovereign bodies. That's how we would see it, presumably.
No, that's a very helpful way of putting it, I think. And Rousseau, Rousseau is certainly extraordinarily concerned with this question of factions. And I think Philip is quite right to say that there's an area in which he's not concerned as explicitly and overtly with a problem that factions can present as he could be. But it is not that he ignores this problem of factions altogether. And I think that's right. When you were giving your talk yesterday and began with the Rousseau dilemma, which is involved with putting law over men, which in a couple of places he refers to, he says, I compare this to the problem of squaring the circle. I regard this as the same as the problem of every civil society having the causes of its own death in it from its birth. You can't square the circle. You can't solve the problem posed by factions permanently in any place, and not just because of some, crooked timber of human nature or defects in our understanding, but by the very nature of the problem, right? So I think you've put very well the dimension that Rousseau does suggest that he's got a solution to a portion of the problem too, but then he's insistent there isn't simply a way of abolishing this political problem once and for all so that we can then just sit back and enjoy ourselves.
Thank you. You've again shown that Rousseau is endlessly fascinating. You may have just answered my question, but I'm going to try it again just in case. Going back to Professor Pettit's presentation of the Rousseau's dilemma, my question is it just Rousseau's dilemma, or is it generally a dilemma for any Republican philosophy? Like, let's say you give up Rousseau's insistence on the indivisibility of sovereignty, and you bring in contestability of the law, you bring in judicial review or tribunal, whatever checks and balances you want. At some point they will still fail, and at some point you will still get an unjust law passed. And do you not then have the same dilemma? The victim of that unjust law, do they live in unfreedom, or are they released from the social contract?
Well, I think that properly speaking, this is a question for Philip, but and I think it's very clear that there is always the possibility of there being unjust measures that Philip would say are unjust laws, that Rousseau would say are things passing themselves off as laws that aren't really laws, right? That formulation is to some extent a hair-splitting difference, because from a practical standpoint, you're left with the question of someone saying, well, that isn't a law, and then the government says it is a law, look at it, right? So surely it is the case that both Philip and Rousseau, and also I would say, we are in a position in which it is perfectly possible for there to be laws of a general nature passed in a community that are unjust. And then the question is, what can be done about it? Or is there a more urgent political problem that we need to turn ourselves to? It occurred to me when Philip said that the Republican view that he supports refuses to make this distinction between lawmaking and other functions of government. Right? So the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch are all involved in lawmaking because they're involved in law interpreting. I think Rousseau does make at least a formal distinction between these, but even the way Philip put it is very helpful for seeing it. The issue is, for Rousseau, the practical issue is the law interpreting problem. And the law interpreting, where it hurts us, is not what the legislative branch does, it's what the executive and judicial branch do. Right? I mean, Rousseau was a great reader of Montesquieu and knows well that being called before a judge is the scary thing. I mean, obviously, being shot by the army at the instructions of the dictator is even scarier, right? But it's really not so much the legislature. They interpret the law, they make the law, and so on. But if the government doesn't do these things to us, then what the legislative branch does is less of an urgent problem. I'm not going to say that it's no problem. And so this question of where the interpretation hits us, that's what we have to watch out for. And that's done by the judicial branch and the executive branch, not so much by the legislative branch, is Rousseau's insistence. I think Philip could very easily say, well, yes, the legislative branch too, because they make laws that then require policies and encourage policies and so on, so the problem doesn't disappear. But I don't think he would deny that it's when the police haul us in someplace that we really feel this, and whatever the law is, if the police are hauling us in and we're being prosecuted without procedures protecting us and so on, whether there's a just or unjust law, we've still got a grave problem.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your lecture and for your reference to considerations on the development of Poland. I think that this book, this work, is very important to constitutionalism and tells much about how to apply which to okay. So let me start just so one sentence from the government of Poland. Fortunately, I have this book with me, so the confederations, because of the executive power they carry with them, will always possess, in moments of dire need, a vigor and capacity to act and act quickly. So my point is that what confederacy is about, confederation is about, it was about giving the executive power back to the people, back to the citizen. Of course, it was a sort of emergency, like the Roman dictatorship, but still, Rousseau's emphasis on the need of confederation is very important. And does it change anything? Does it add anything to his previous insistence on the separation of the legislative and the executive, the sovereignty and the executive?
Rousseau's discussion of the confederations in Poland, these organizations of the nobles and their followers who rise up in arms, he regards as in Poland an extraordinarily dangerous institution which has had recently very good effects, but in principle can have very bad effects. But he insists that the proper function of having armed groups of citizens who rise up is when it is impossible for citizens to appeal beyond the government to an authority over the government to which they belong, right? He says it's when the government prevents the sovereign assembly from meeting. So, you know, there are the two sides to Rousseau's rhetoric about these things. On the one hand, we all tend to think of Rousseau as the revolutionary figure, and Rousseau's suggestion of the need for armed insurrection in some cases, his suggestion that in Geneva that citizens will know what to do without him telling them, which seems to imply that they should overthrow the government, is a very powerful side of his thought. On the other hand, it's also true that he always presents these things as conservative measures. And I think this is not merely a rhetorical device to make his position either more appealing to citizens or a device to protect him against accusations by the government of meddling in business that's none of his. It really is his understanding of what the political problem is for citizens. The political problem for citizens is how to maintain the structure of the laws against a government that applies them wrongly and usurps the function. This, I think, is what he's talking about in his discussion of the confederations as well.